I'm Dr. Gene Sherman, founder and director of the Sherman Center for Culture and Ideas, otherwise known as SCCI. You're about to watch a SCCI Virtual Fashion Hub 2020 episode. Thank you for joining us. Over recent months, SCCI has captured the expertise of designers, makers, writers, historians, artists, curators, museum leaders, philanthropists, politicians, and change makers. We will continue sharing their comprehensive and diverse expertise. As we move forward together, SCCI is proud to bring you these leading voices in contemporary culture during this time of uncertainty and opportunity for change.
There's a place between two stands of trees where the grass grows uphill and the old revolutionary road breaks off into shadows, near a meeting house abandoned by the persecuted who disappeared into those shadows. I've walked there, picking mushrooms at the edge of dread, but don't be fooled. This isn't a Russian poem. This is not somewhere else, but here. Our country, moving closer to its own truth and dread, its own ways of making people disappear. I won't tell you where the place is, the dark mesh of the woods, meeting the unmarked strip of light, ghost-ridden crossroads, leaf mold paradise. I know already who wants to buy it, sell it, make it disappear. And I won't tell you where it is, so why do I tell you anything? Because you still listen. Because in times like these, to have you listen at all, it's necessary to talk about trees.
I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the land of Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. Gene, while Australia is beginning to emerge from lockdown and there's already some nostalgia for ISO life, people experience self-isolation in different ways. Introverts like me loved the solitude. For some, it was a chance to reflect, to escape daily pressures, and for others, it was an anxious and stressful time. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about your experience of isolation. Were there downsides or unexpected benefits that you would like to see continued in your post-lockdown life?
It's an interesting question because I fought against it like a tiger initially. I just refused. I said, I'm not going into lockdown. I don't see the need. I'm elderly now. I will take my chances with death. And I've led a perfectly sort of acceptable life. And I had a terrible fight with my son. So that's how I started this process. However, as things became more and more serious and I became more and more aware of my actions and their impact on other people, I recognized that I would have to knuckle down and conform. I don't conform easily. And also I'm claustrophobic, and I felt very strongly that I might feel sort of locked in without being able to get out, which is a deep-seated fear in me. So I had to knuckle down. I had 2 days of feeling quite nauseous, which was for me a flag indicating that I was embarking on a road to anxiety, which I don't like. I've experienced it in the past. I've had quite a few serious ups and downs in my life, and I did not want to go along the path of feeling out of control. My way of dealing with that feeling is to structure my life. It's very structured anyway, but I had to create a new structure in this situation. And so I got together with my wonderful team, very talented group of people, and we brainstormed and decided to do a virtual hub, of which this conversation is part. And these films replicate to an extent what we would have done in a live audience hub without the international speakers. So that was my first impetus: keep busy, be structured, create something new. Then I had to think about my personal life. I can't work 24/7. And so I think that my husband, who has Parkinson's, very well known, has had more of me than he's ever had, I think. And I think that's been a bonus. It's a bonus for him. It's a bonus for me. I've had to learn patience, which I don't have in great quantities. We've revisited films that we watched, for example, when we were in our 20s and living in London. And we've revisited photographs, for example, that we've archived, and we're now noting who people are, for the archive, a photographic archive, which means we're going back into memory.
And are there elements of that you will take with you moving forward?
I think what I'll take with me, just to finally answer the question, is I am not going to, going forward, have 5 outside meetings a day and work till 2 a.m. in the morning. I've decided I'm too old and I'm not going back to that level of scheduling again.
I want to ask you about, you said that you wanted to create something new,
yes.
Which is what you've done with the SCCI Virtual Hubs. I mean, all across the world, we've been seeing artistic and cultural bodies and heritage organisations innovate and adapt in these unique circumstances. And you were actually described as the queen of pivot. I mean, COVID has clearly been an opportunity for reinvention, particularly in the digital realm. And so what was your thinking behind the SCCI Virtual Hubs?
Well, for me, doing something is only worth doing it if one does it at the highest possible level. I don't believe in winging it. I just don't. I feel that if there's so many things one can do. So if one hasn't got the resources, or one doesn't have the means, or for some reason one doesn't have the right people around one, whatever the obstacles may be, that just to do what you want to do at the best possible level, and if that's impractical, choose something else. So my idea, sitting as we are with a professional film crew around us, in a way improve upon, within a certain framework, the kind of live audience hubs that we loved and which everybody seemed to love and come to, because we can bring in footage that we couldn't have brought in with a live audience.
And this will obviously inform your thinking going forward for your forthcoming hubs, such as the proposed architecture one in October. Can I ask you, I mean, Australians have obviously become very digitally savvy over the last few months. Even my father, who's 82, is using Zoom. I mean, is digital our answer to the tyranny of distance, that phrase coined by Geoffrey Blainey in 1966?
Look, the tyranny of distance was my terror phrase when I came to Australia. I made 2 migrations to this country, one in 1964 with my parents. I was 18 and I spent almost a year at Melbourne University. We fled. We went back. We felt we'd made a mistake. Because the tyranny of distance weighed so heavily on us. And although we were in Africa, we were hardly in London or in New York, much less in Tokyo, but we felt in Africa somehow far more connected. There was a flight when I was growing up, from Johannesburg to London, which was 9 hours. It was like going to Tokyo. When apartheid hardened, we had to fly around the hump of Africa, and at that point the flight became 13 hours, a bit like us going to LA now. I don't know, we just felt more connected. We arrived in Melbourne in 1964, and we felt the tyranny of distance weigh on us like a ton of bricks. So coming back to Australia, and I won't go into the personal story, it's for another time, but we lived in London, made our way back in 1976. It still weighed on us, but not to the same extent. The Opera House had been built. Gough Whitlam had come and gone, just come and gone. And somehow we started feeling that we could live here and be connected to our diasporic family, which is in every corner of the globe, and to the many languages that are spoken in our family. We felt just more at home. So this is a way of overcoming the tyranny of distance.
I mean, there have been a number of comparisons to, for example, the Great Depression of the 1930s, in that it created a demand for culture. And during the Second World War, Britain made efforts to ensure the sustainability of the arts by establishing a council for the encouragement of music and the arts. And when the war was over, there was the building of new concert halls and theatres, art galleries and museums as a way of restoring cultural pride and creating economic resurgence.
I expect you're wondering what that means. CEMA, Council for the Encouragement of Music and the Arts. This council was started in the first winter of the war to bring pleasure and the highest forms of inspiration to those millions who were, as it were, blacked out in the general blackout all over Britain at that time. This council took music and the arts, and still takes them, to factories, mining towns, seaports, which may have suffered in the war or may be cut off from their normal sorts of entertainment. And behind all these activities of CEMA is an intricate organization where they arrange a program which is constantly changing all over the country.
And in fact, in a 1953 speech at the Royal Academy, Churchill is quoted as saying, "The arts are essential to any complete national life. The nation owes it to itself to sustain and encourage them." In these current circumstances, how can the arts demonstrate that it's as intrinsic to the wider public as health, education and social welfare?
You know, Dolla, that is the question of the moment, really. If at the current time, with the entire world population tuning into the arts as their principal source of solace, of stimulation, and of kind of being in the world, if governments don't realize it now, I honestly don't know what will convince them. But I will go back to Roosevelt and the early 1930s and the Great Depression and that public works program that he put in place. It's a very well-known program. And it differs from a lot of what's being done now in that the works that were made by the artists at that time were permanent. He actually put artists on salaries. It was a 10-year program, and they were commissioned to create murals. There were fewer options at that time because, they didn't have moving image work and photography wasn't as well considered as an art form, etc. But they certainly had painting and sculpture and tapestries, fibre art, murals, all of that. Those pathways were open to artists.
In a federal art project, sculpture is being produced for schools and public buildings. Under the Works program, artists, actors, writers, and musicians contribute their share to the cultural development of the community. To make books more readily available, WPA has increased the staffs of free libraries. The highly specialized art of creating stained glass windows, mastered by a few artists in the world, is fostered by WPA and Windows for the United States Military Academy at West Point. Here, too, a vast mural painting has been completed. The Works program has sponsored symphony orchestras and band concerts. Artists under the Works program make New York a better place in which to live. The Federal Theater Project, which has provided employment for hundreds of professionals, has produced a number of successful plays and entertainments. It has been repeatedly said that new life was injected into the fading American theater by the stage productions of WPA.
You had great works of art permanently installed in major public buildings for a very low price that went on, and short of those buildings being pulled down, which as we know does happen, these works are available to us now, a century later. So why don't we do it? And in fact, when I was asked by the City of Sydney, right at the beginning of the crisis, to put forward some ideas as to what to do about artists, that's precisely what I wrote in more or less those words. Now, the City of Sydney has been wonderful. I really do mean this, in that they have come up with all sorts of schemes. In addition, Ben Gurion in Israel in 1948, after the war, the place was an absolute basket case. Every Arab country wanted to wipe it off the face of the earth, which is still the case for some countries. It was put into place via vote in the United Nations, so it had legitimacy. And they were fighting just to survive. And Ben Gurion was asked for some money for culture, and I can't quote it, I can't remember the quote, and he probably said it in Hebrew, but he did say something akin to what Churchill said.
I mean, Peter Collins, who served from 1988 to 1995 and is considered by many to have been one of Australia's best arts ministers, was quoted as saying, "Of course, there are never any votes in it. Artists on the whole want to change the world, while conservatives don't." Is there some truth in that?
Well, I think there aren't votes in it. I mean, if there were votes in it, then we would be in a better shape. But not everything needs to be monetized or translated into tangible outcomes. I think symbolism, as most politicians would recognize and know, symbolism is very powerful in people's lives. Why do propaganda machines in the great dictatorships, great used not positively, in the grand dictatorships of our time and before, why are they so keen to use symbolic gestures, to put on symbolic uniforms, to sing symbolic songs, if symbolism isn't powerful? So why do these practical people refuse to recognize the benefits of something that is powerful that you can't actually quantify or monetize? It's a mystery to me. Someone can answer it. I'd be delighted to hear the answer.
I mean, for the arts sector, in addition to COVID, the sector has faced a raft of social, legal and political pressures, new legislation, incoherent and inconsistent government policy, loss of autonomy, fear of media backlash or social media storms, and loss of funding means that arts organisations are not always confident about taking the kinds of risks they would like to. But is now the time for big ideas to challenge that risk-averse culture?
Well, every time is a time for big ideas in my book. I mean, there are plenty of people busy with small ideas, and I think they're important. You know the saying, the old cliche, the devil's in the detail. You can have as many big ideas as you like, but the devil will be in the detail. If you can't action them and you don't have people who care or mind these details or take note of them or adapt when the details aren't working, then the big ideas are meaningless. Anybody can say we want world peace, but who is going to, delve into that and establish a peace plan, and then who is going to action the peace plan and who's going to monitor it? So everything has to start with a theory, a big idea, an overall vision, a looking into the future. I'm so future, you know me well enough. I'm so future-oriented. You think of an idea that is meaningful in the long term, and then you work back into the medium and short term in order to action those ideas. I've always tried to put that into practice in my own tiny way, but it could be put into practice within larger contexts, but often it's not. There are knee-jerk reactions, there's this little detail here and that little detail there, and nobody's thinking, but what is the vision? Where are we actually going?
The bigger picture.
The bigger picture.
6 months ago, none of us could have imagined how our world and our lives would be thrown into turmoil by this new virus. The pandemic has brought out the best and the worst of humanity.
We are ready from the technical side. We will go first.
We all want this to be over. We all want to get on with our lives. But the hard reality is, this is not even close to being over.
Once again, journalists, that if they wish, they can.
The critical question that all countries will face in the coming months is how to live with this virus. That is the new normal.
Governments across the world have been talking about us getting back to normal. But is this actually what we want? Do we want that return to normal? Industries such as fashion are questioning the traditional systems. Should they have so many fashion shows? What about the glut of unsolved inventory? What's the point of fashion seasons in a global market? And this disconnect between retail cycles and consumers. Saint Laurent, for example, announced it was now going to skip Paris Fashion Week and set its own schedule. What are some of the changes you would like to see?
Well, I would hope we would not go back to the old normal. And I'm so pleased that you've identified, and I know you've deliberately done it, the fashion industry, because I think it's one of the industries that is in need of a monumental reset. On the one hand, you have the waste, and I am anti-waste if ever there is a person on this planet, in every sense. I can't bear wasting a grain of rice or a garment in my wardrobe. I always feel, and I always have, this comes from my mother. It comes also from living in a country, unlike Australia, where you looked out the window and saw poverty in your face. It's very different when you look out the window and everybody looks fairly well dressed as though they're going off to meaningful employment, than when you look out the window and you see people suffering. So my family background and South Africa, where I grew up, was very telling in forming the kind of opinions I have with regard to waste. The fashion industry, I don't have the figures at my fingertips, but the waste is monumental. Landfill, our oceans are filled with garments that our young Instagram generation has bought for $20. And in Lee Edelcourt's words, a jacket costs less than the price of a sandwich.
Manufacturing is my other point, which, as you know, is a very big problem because we have farmed it out with disastrous results, with slavery, and it continues. With sometimes when you buy a T-shirt, you kill somebody. It's better to buy fur, as a sort of matter of speech. And the latest comers on the market of cheaper and cheaper prices, Primark, now got a few pages in Vogue, the temple of luxury goods, with evening dresses for £10. How is it possible that a garment is cheaper than a sandwich? How can a product that needs to be sown, grown, harvested, combed, spun, knitted, cut and stitched, finished, printed, labeled, packaged and transported cost a couple of euros? It's impossible. It is impossible. So you cannot blame the consumer. They are happy to have new goods. And I guess that we should together make a quest to make legislation in Europe at least to have minimum prices.
I want to get back to Lee Edelcourt in a second, because I also want to ask a similar question around the cultural sector. Frances Morris, director of a Tate Modern, who you recently spoke to, suggests that footfall driving blockbuster exhibitions with the star loans shipped carbon intensively from Berlin to LA to Tokyo to Sydney might have had their day. It would be great for museums to focus on their permanent collections, the amazing things we already possess. We've taken our eye off the core mission. I'd love a return to slower looking. Do you think blockbuster exhibitions and the big art fairs are a thing of the past?
Well, I want to equate it with fashion, although, of course, you can't balance the one totally against the other. I think there are other ways to doing it. I think marching to the beat of one's own drum for these big fashion houses is a wonderful idea. Why does everybody have to get along the same on the same bandwagon and march to a drum that is what? Set by the commercial interests of these huge fashion conglomerates. So let's park fashion on one side now. Now come back to your wonderful question, and I think Francis, whom I have huge regard for, is wonderful comment on the blockbuster. Look, I think people like razzmatazz. I think we can't pretend we don't. And I think there's a place for razzmatazz and there's a place for a kind of extravagance, but it doesn't have to be the order of every day. And, you know, the more you feed people sugar, the more sugar they want. We all know this. So I think if you feed people sugar, and I'm talking metaphorically now, you'll end up by fueling a desire for more. What's enough, finally? How big is a blockbuster? How many fashion weeks can one, go to? How big are these sets? How much more money can one spend on these sets, particularly when the workers are being paid a pittance, have no security, they're not allowed to group. These are the workers in Bangladesh and India who are actually the artisans making the garments that are simply finished in Europe and sold under the rubric, under the label of Made in Italy.
So in that context,
yes.
then, Jean, how important is the local going to be?
We know that masks being in short supply, that had to come from elsewhere, put people into a panic. Why do we have to rely on some other country to provide us with masks? And that doesn't just apply to Australia, it applies to every country. I think the basic kind of needs of a country, where possible, again, it needs economic management and expertise that I don't have. But I think that we need to be able to supply ourselves with our basic needs. We need to have the occasional razzmatazz fashion week or fashion show and the occasional razzmatazz blockbuster. But it doesn't need to be this merry-go-round that we have established. And coming back to your question, the new normal should be less is more, really.
So coming back to Lee Eldercourt, who you referenced, she's a trend forecaster.
Yes.
And she says that the coronavirus offers a blank page for a new beginning, an opportunity for humanity to reset its values. I mean, like Eldercourt, are you hopeful for a better system?
I'm hopeful. One lives in hope, but I am not optimistic because I think human nature, regardless of what history tells us, does not knuckle down and learn from the past. One hopes, one must hope, and things have improved in some places, but you know, Dolla, there's talk now that the colonial period is over, by and large. We have a biennale on, which is talking about post-colonialism and the people who have suffered under the colonial yoke. So we all pat ourselves on the back and say, thank heavens that era is over. Now let's listen to these marginalised voices and find out how they've suffered, and hopefully we can build a better world. But the truth is that colonialism and slavery, for that matter, has simply taken, the two of them have simply taken on a new look, a new face. What are these toiling masses in India and Bangladesh doing if not servicing the Western world, the richer countries in the world, via their suffering? So isn't that, in a way, another form of colonialism? So the British are no longer in India, but the fashion industry, as an example, is using lower than it should be, far lower than it should be wages and shocking working conditions and an inability to group and make demands for better conditions as a way to earn extra money in a faraway country.
I mean, you mentioned the Biennale of Sydney and Niran, which closed down 10 days, I think, after it had opened. And it addresses issues, exactly as you say, around memory, colonialisation, dispossession. But it also addresses the environment.
Yes.
And in a way, is COVID-19 a dress rehearsal for a much bigger challenge, which is climate change? And will climate change be pushed to the back burner as we try and rebuild the economy?
It's clear that the environment is changing. I mean, any 10-year-old child could tell you that. It's getting hotter. But I think you saw the Oliver Eliasson exhibition outside of the Tate, in and outside of the Tate Modern in London. Now, that Ice Watch, which is a exhibition that he put together in 2014 and which travelled the world, it went to various places before coming to London in 2018, he actually brought, I mean, it's quite an astonishing thing as an artist that this very famous now Icelandic artist managed to do. He brought a huge ice boulders to England and to various other parts of the world when the exhibition was on elsewhere, right in front of the Tate Modern in 2018, and people watched them melt. Seeing those things, people do understand what they can touch. There are pictures of people hugging these icebergs. From Greenland he brought them. So they're not constructed icebergs, they're real icebergs. And people watch them in the centre of London melt, disappear. So I think that's a very good way that an artist can, make clear to people what's actually happening.
So, Gene, how do you think you're a reader, a long-standing reader? How will we tell the story of COVID? Is it going to be an anecdote, an urban myth, or an epic?
Well, it'll be a collective epic, I think. I think that this example, Oliver Eliasson, is a good example of a small chapter in what will be an epic. And I'd like to go back to history because I am a reader. Literature was my first profession and also my first playing field, if you like. I think, let's go back in time to Guernica. Picasso's Guernica, 1937, a monumental painting. I forget the exact size. It was done by Picasso, created in 1937, before the outbreak of the Second World War, which, as we know, was 1939. But Hitler was already busy from 1933, and he supported Franco, the dictator in Spain. And Guernica is the name of a town in the Basque area in Spain. And with Hitler's help, Guernica, this town, was bombed. And Picasso painted this picture to represent the death and destruction that came from that bombing.
First pictures from the Basque Republic of the holy city of Guernica, scene of the most terrible air raid our modern history yet can boast. Hundreds were killed here, men, women and children. 4,000 bombs were dropped out of a blue sky into a hell that raged unchecked for 5 murderous hours. This was a city, and these were homes like yours.
And for people who are involved in the arts or in visual culture, at least the image of Guernica, they might not know all the details that I've shared now with you, but the image of Guernica would be, I think, familiar to most people. Then let's jump back to the beginning of the 19th century, around 02 or somewhere between 1802 and 1810, just before the fall of Napoleon. Napoleon, as we know, conquered Europe. Now, it's often seen as a very heroic mission, and he did bring the Code Napoleon, the Napoleon Code. He brought some of the liberties that were encapsulated in the French Revolution mandate. He was very important worldwide. But what happened when he conquered all these countries? He didn't just walk in and say, "Here I am," everybody said, "Welcome." He caused havoc. And so Goya created 82 prints called The Disasters of War, which most people, at least interested, not just art historians, but people who go to galleries, and millions of them go. All of these people are seeing art, and at some point or another would have bought a catalogue or looked at an art book or maybe studied art at school. So all these people would be familiar with one or two of those Goya images. What were they about? Massacres. This is Napoleon in Spain. Massacres, torture, rape. So isn't that an epic? It's a sort of ongoing epic, but I don't know, do people listen? I am in contact with a number of young people through the work I've done, went back to South Africa to point post-apartheid. I mean, they're young people who are so little aware here and there of anything historical.
Perhaps, but there are also young people who are incredibly resilient,
That's
I think,
true.
also.
And there are young people who are aware, and hopefully those become the leaders.
Thank you, Gene.
Thanks, Dolla.